What I'd like to talk with you today is a topic that I think is incredibly important. It's not a topic that I think is very sexy, and it's something that often gets ignored when building applications, even Google's applications. But I think it's really important to talk about accessibility, making applications not only available to a wide variety of people, but usable by those same people. As a way of getting into this, I want you to think about the Google Plus page. All of you have probably seen this. There's a button up in the top corner that says Add to Circles. And the interaction model is the following. I take my mouse, I hover it over the Add to Circles button, and then something pops up. And at that point, I'm able to select circles into which I can put one of my friends or one of my contacts. This works really, really well if I can use a mouse. All of you close your eyes. Now grab your mouse and hover over the, that's kind of problematic, right? If I can't see the screen, how do I use my mouse to hover over anything on the screen? This mode of interaction, while very interactive, while very rich, excludes a wide variety of people that either can't or don't want to use the keyboard for some reason. And in fact, when we first launched Plus, this was completely inaccessible. It was impossible to use the circle picker widget with anything other than a mouse. If you didn't have a mouse, you were simply out of luck. What I want to talk about today is how we can avoid that, how we can build applications that are accessible and universally usable. There are a couple of types of accessibility, and the type that I really want to talk about today is users that use an assistive technology of some sort in order to access a website. These users could be blind, they might be completely unable to see the screen, in which case they're going to use something like a screen reader or a braille reader in order to get the information provided to them in a form that they can access. They could be users with low vision. In this case, they might use a magnifier or a lens of some sort in order to make objects on the screen bigger so that they can actually interact with them well. Or they could be motor impaired in some way. There are people that use foot pedals, there are people that only can use individual fingers, or they might have some sort of mouth control, be it either with a physical object that they control with a tongue, or with speech control, such that they can simulate clicks on specific items on the page. We want to be able to support all of these users, and what I want to talk about today is how we can do that with HTML5 and with screen readers. One such screen reader is called ChromeVox. ChromeVox is a screen reader built specifically for Chrome by the Chrome accessibility team. This uses the text-to-speech API that Chrome provides as an extension API. So anyone can write anything exactly like this. And actually all the code is open source, so you can take a look at it, see exactly how it works. This is completely free, you can download it. It's built directly into Chrome OS as the accessibility mechanism for Chrome OS, and you can download it for Chrome on any other platform. It'll work quite well, and in fact I'll demo it a little bit today.
Enter your name. Choose your favorite screen reader introduction, heading 3.
This is what Chromebox sounds like. If one of you hasn't used a screen reader before, this is what it sounds like. You get a very mechanical
Enter your
tone
name, edit text.
that reads off the thing that you're currently focused on the page. And generally speaking, we'll give you some meta information about that. So when we go back up to the header, we'll hear
Screen reader introduction, heading 3.
it tells you that it's a heading, and it tells you that it's a level 3 heading. What this tells you is that the semantics of your page are really critically important. If we jump down into the form,
Enter your name, edit text.
here we read not only that you can type something into this field, but we get a label for it as well. This gives you a really kind of a rich visual or a rich mental image of what a visual user would see on this page.
Choose your favorite color, red, list box 1 of 10.
There's a list box. There are 10 items. It gives you some semantics along with it.
Submit button. Having trouble? Click here for help link.
So it tells you that there's a link on the page. And there's some other controls so that you can see exactly where that link goes and a variety of other functionality, but that's the basics. What I want to talk about today, with that in mind, are 3 things. First, I want to talk about what you do when you're starting from scratch. When you have complete control over the HTML, what's the best practice? What should you start out with? Second, I want to talk about the case that most of us find ourselves in, where we have an application that isn't exactly semantic. It doesn't work quite as well as we'd like it to in terms of the markup or in terms of the CSS, but we still want to make sure that it's accessible. How do we go about doing that? And finally, I'll point you to some tools and resources that you can look at later on. There's a lot of information here. I'm not going to touch even half of what it takes to make a website accessible. But I am going to give you some pointers, and I hope that I give you a good basis. So let's start out. What's really important to understand about Chrome, or about screen readers in general, is that all they have to work with is the DOM. They have the document object model. This means that the semantics of your page are incredibly important, and the visual aspect of your page is incredibly unimportant. For instance, we can all see that this sentence here is, "The rain in Spain stays mainly on the plain." Let's see what Chromebox thinks about it.
Example heading: The plane in rain stays mainly in the Spain.
That's a bit odd. I wonder why that happened. If we look at the DOM that was used to create this, we see that what's happened is that we've simply used absolute positioning in order to move things around on the page so that they look like they're in a certain order. In the sentence, it makes very little sense to do that, but in our applications, we do this all the time. We take things from disparate parts of the DOM and we jam them together visually because that makes sense. That's how they should be. But we didn't code it that way. In fact, we coded them at separate ends of the spectrum. And in that case, a screen reader user, or anyone who only is able to work with the DOM, is going to have a really hard time understanding your web page and working with your web page. So it's important to understand a couple of things, or to think about a couple of things when working with DOM and when creating a website. What's really important, first off, is to have logical sections of your page and to order those sections in a way that makes sense for someone who's trying to use this application. In other words, the thing that's most important about your page should probably come near the top of the DOM. The things that are much less important should probably come near the bottom. Even if it's easier for you in some way to put navigation links all the way at the top of the DOM, those probably aren't the things that people are most interested in. So you want to put them later on the page. It's also important to group the things in the page together that have any sort of semantic relationship with each other. You can use any sort of HTML5 tag to do that. For example, the section tag. Last thing, yeah, it's important not to use tables. Tables are for layout, or not for layout. They are for data. If you're trying to set up something on your page with tables, then you are at the wrong conference in general. So don't do that. Interactive controls. What's interesting about a lot of applications and a lot of modern web applications that we see on the web today is that people are using div and span to mean absolutely everything. This is a really bad practice for a wide variety of reasons. There are elements that actually have semantics associated with them and have interaction associated with them. For instance, if I have an on-click event on a div, I have to do a lot of work in order to make that replicate something like a button. If I just use the button element, I get a lot of that for free. I get some keyboard interactions. I'm ensured that it has the exact same semantics as a native button on a native web application because the browser is doing the work for me. I don't have to go through and build all of this out myself. I can leverage the power of the browser, use the correct element, and in that case, get things like keyboard accessibility almost for free. This is just good practice. There's no reason not to do this at all. The last thing here that's really important to note is that divs and spans are by default not focusable. If they're not focusable, they don't show up for a screen reader. It's just that simple. You need to make sure that anything that a person is interacting with can obtain focus on the page. I'll give you a quick example of why that's important in a little bit. So if we turn Chromebox back on.
Send, custom button, live coding example, heading 3. Click on this button. So
there's probably a button coming up, right? I've just heard some text that said button. That's important. All right, so let's jump to the next element on the page.
Send.
Send. Okay, let's hit a button. Well, nothing seems to be happening. I wonder why that is. If I click on send, of course, I get an alert. Something's going wrong here. What could it be? The most important thing is to simply change this to a button. If we change it to a button, and then refresh.
Send button.
Send button. Chromebox now recognizes this as a semantic element. If I hit enter again, I get the alert. In other words,
send button.
Enter will simulate a click if the element is a button. The browser will do the work for you. If it wasn't a button, you would have to do things like on key down and then have an event handler for on key down in order to make sure that you replicated all of the functionality that a browser would. This is something that you simply don't want to do on your own. You want to make sure that you use the right elements.
Labeling, label your.
What's also important, specifically with regard to forms, is to make sure that every element on the page that users are going to interact with in some way has a label. This is incredibly important, and it's difficult to overemphasize how important this is. If you don't have labels, then you simply have text boxes on the page. A text box is completely meaningless without context. I know that I'm supposed to enter some information into this text box, but I have no idea what it is, and I have no idea why it might be important for my interaction with this application. If, on the other hand, I have a label, and the label syntax is absolutely trivial, you simply say label and then use an ID in order to say what this thing is labeling. If I do that, then the screen reader will understand that there is a semantic relationship between the text and the element on the page, and will bind those together when it reads them out to me. In other words, I will get good semantic information about what this thing on the page is that I'm meant to interact with. Again, and this should be really, really basic, every image on your page should have an alt tag. There's no reason at all that an image shouldn't have an alt tag. There are two types, however, of images on your page. There are images that replicate information that's already available. In other words, they are purely decorative. And there are images that are, in and of themselves, informative. For the former type, you should have a blank alt tag. If you have a blank alt tag, that means I've thought about this. This image exists on the page. It is visually important, but it has absolutely no semantic meaning. In that case, the screen reader will simply ignore it. A blank alt tag means ignore this image. A missing alt tag is, however, something completely different, and we'll look at exactly what that does in a moment. But for the normal use case, you have an image on the page that is informative in some way. You should have alt text associated with that that says, this image has some meaning, here's what it is. Otherwise, it's completely useless for a person who can't see the page. So again, let's take a quick look at what a form sounds like when you don't do things correctly.
Label, edit text.
Edit text. There's nothing here. I know that there's a text box. I should probably type something, but I have no idea what it is. Whoops.
Password, edit text.
Password, edit text. That's interesting. It doesn't really help me. I know that it's a password, and that's better, but it really doesn't help very much. Now let's look at the image. What's really interesting about this is that I have no alt tag here at all. This means
password, edit text.
This means that the browser is going to try to figure out something for me, and usually it does an absolutely miserable job.
901D3N94T3 image.
So it reads the name of the image, especially when you have these sorts of big CMS systems that automatically generate images in a variety of sizes and a variety of contexts. The name of the image is never informative, but it's just common practice that a screen reader will try to give you any information that it has. And in this case, the only information it has is the name of the image. This is really, really bad behavior, and it's something that you should avoid to whatever extent possible when building your own applications. Let's look at how we would solve this problem. The first thing we would need to do is change these spans to labels. By doing so, we give each of the elements on the page, or each of the form elements, semantic information. We tell it that the first label is pointing to the first form element. I can't talk and type at the same time, as we are finding out for user. I just can't type at all, I think is the problem. So.
Username, edit text.
So this time when I click on it, and if I had given it focus in some other way, it would have behaved the same. When I click on it, it not only reads out that it is an edit text box, it also tells me the label associated with it. So I know that here I am supposed to type my username. That's excellent behavior. Now let's fix the image.
Username, PIN, password, edit text. Golden Gate.
Excellent. So now I know that there is information associated with this image. And in that case, I'm actually able to use it to understand the page. So again, big lesson here, use an alt tag, use labels. Both of them are absolutely critically important and really very basic. If you're not doing this already, you're doing the wrong thing. What we've talked about and what we've seen here is that focus is really important. You see a big outline on the page of what the focused element is. The focused element is exactly what the user is currently interacting with. If they have a mouse, they might be hovering over something completely different, or they might be clicking on things that can't actually accept focus. That simply isn't the case when you're dealing with someone who's using a screen reader. In this case, you need to make sure that you provide focus hooks within your application. First of all, that the important elements that the user is supposed to interact with are focusable, and second, that you not only accept things like hover, but you also accept click and on key down and a variety of other things along those lines. What will become important later on, or what we're going to see later on, is that it's not only important to ensure that each element can be focused, but also important to manage the focus on the page. If, for instance, I have a dialog box that pops up, I want to make sure that the focus stays within that dialog box if it's modal. We'll show a quick example of how that might work. So here I have buy more printer ink. I get a modal dialog box. I see that it's modal because the screen has been darkened. So I have some sort of visual feedback that I should click on one of these two buttons before I do anything else. And I'll click on that. Let's see how it sounds.
Pop-up dialog, buy more printer ink button.
So it's a button, that's good. I hit a button. What happened? According to the screen reader, absolutely nothing, because the focus didn't move. I hit enter, or I clicked on it, but the focus stayed on the button because nothing told the focus to move. What really needs to happen here, or probably the best case scenario, is to move the focus programmatically to the first focusable element within the context of this dialog box. Let's see what we can do about that. Happily, moving focus around is incredibly trivial. You simply have to call focus on the correct element. Let's look at it again.
OK button.
What we see here is that focus was automatically moved inside the context of this dialog box. That's great. However, there's another aspect that we need to think about. What happens when I click on one of these two buttons? What happens in that scenario? If I hit enter, focus is dropped on the floor. In other words, nothing on this page has focus anymore, which means that the screen reader is going to start back up at the top of the page. That's a really bad experience. What we instead want to happen is to bring the user directly back to where they were when they activated this dialog box. We can do that relatively trivially. So here we see that the button is called confirm, so I can simply associate focus with confirm. If I refresh this, I click.
OK button.
Jumps me in.
Buy more printer ink button.
Jumps me back out. This is good experience. This means that I move directly from the dialogue directly back onto the page where I was. I know where I am, I understand the context, and I'm able to deal with that. What is problematic, however, is that if I keep hitting tab, I can actually jump outside of this dialog box. Visually, I understand that I'm not supposed to do that. The page is dark. However, that doesn't really work when dealing with a screen reader. Instead, we need to manage focus for the user in order to show them that they should stay within the context. They need to make a decision, yes or no. That's the only time you should use a modal dialogue. So how can we go about doing that? Unfortunately,
buy more printer ink button.
It's a little bit more code.
Bar last focus. OK.
So I will copy. I am cheating, and it's awesome. There we go. So now I'm hitting tab and trying to get out of the box. So shift tab would bring me to the previous focus item. I'm not able to. I've thrown in some code that makes it possible for me to intercept blur events and focus events and make sure that I'm only focusing on one of the two items that should be focusable within the context that I currently find myself. This isn't that difficult. Basically, I'm really just adding event listeners and dealing with it. And now Chrome is crashing. Haha. You know what's awesome? Dev version of Chrome. I really recommend that you use the dev version of Chrome. I do not recommend that you demo with the dev version of Chrome because it causes small problems like this. Good times. Let's see if I can get out of this. Regardless. Haha, good times. My good friend force quit. My good friend force quit. There we go. Hey, look at that. Now let's open this back up. So what you might not know about Chrome is that we have 3 different channels. Actually, we have 4, but 3 are important. We have a stable channel. That's what every user actually gets, and it is, as the name implies, stable. We have a beta channel. The beta channel is a little bit less stable than stable. Stable gets built about every 6 weeks. Beta gets built probably about every 3 weeks. Dev, on the other hand, is built on a weekly basis, sometimes more than weekly. More than weekly is actually awesome because it shows you exactly what's happening on trunk, but it's slightly problematic in that sometimes it's broken, like now. Haha. Anyway, The last thing I'd point out when dealing with applications that you have complete control over are keyboard shortcuts. It's really quite useful to give users the ability to control the application in a controlled way with a keyboard. For instance, if you go to Gmail, you might not know that you're able to use Vim key bindings, so J and K, in order to jump between messages. You're able to use some key bindings in order to archive and jump back to the inbox, and it actually makes you much more efficient. For specific types of applications, keyboard shortcuts can be incredibly useful. And there are 3 types that I list up here. I don't really think it's incredibly important to talk about them, and I'm running out of time, so I'll move on. We've talked about the ideal world. When you have complete control, you want to use semantic elements, and you want to make sure that you manage focus correctly, and that you only use those elements that kind of do all the work for you, that you use buttons instead of divs and so on. What we usually end up with in the real world is code that kind of looks like this. It's just a jumble of random crap thrown onto the page. You need to figure out first what it is, and then you need to change it to do something useful and accessible. Generally, this means you're trying to build an interactive control that HTML simply doesn't provide for you. So if we look back to the circle picker that we looked at before, there's no native HTML widget that says when I hover over this thing, pop something up and do some sort of checkboxy goodness. That simply doesn't exist as part of HTML. It's something you need to build on your own. And when we find ourselves in these sorts of situations, we need to figure out how we implement that in a way that is actually accessible. One thing that we can use is something new called ARIA. ARIA is part of the HTML5 specification, kind of, depending on who you ask. And it gives more semantic information, or it allows you to create semantic relationships, first of all, between elements on the page, but also to add semantics to an element, like a div, that by itself means absolutely nothing. If we look at something like this, this is kind of what the widget looks like. You have 2 pieces. You have a button and you have a pop-up. And we need to figure out how we can make those accessible. The HTML that we are stuck with, for whatever reason, looks like this. So we've got some divs, we got some spans. There's really nothing here that a user can actually do anything with the screen reader. So what do we do about it? The first thing we need to do is make sure that the elements that a user interacts with are focusable. Divs, as I said before, by themselves are not focusable. They simply get ignored by the screen reader, and instead it jumps to the content. What we can do, however, in order to make it focusable, is to add a tab index. Tab index means when you are tabbing through the page, when you're using the tab key to jump between the focusable elements, first of all, this element should be in the tab order, and second of all, perhaps it has a specific position. I have never actually used tab order to say that an element has a specific position. Instead, I set a tab order of 0, which means this element is focusable, and this element should appear wherever it appears in the DOM. A tab index of -1 is also sometimes useful for specific scenarios. This means that if you're tabbing through the page, this element doesn't get focus, but if you're using a screen reader, or if you want to programmatically assign focus in some way, you can. Sorry? Sure. We can talk about details and stuff later on. Right. So we talked a little bit earlier about the keyboard and about the fact that the keyboard is an incredibly important mechanism for interacting with a web page. You need to make sure that you support it. This means that your custom control should respond to the keyboard in the same way that a native control does. This means if, for example, I tab over to a link on the page and I hit enter, that link is going to be executed. I'm going to jump to that link. If I am on a button and I hit enter, it's going to do something. I need to make sure that my custom element does the exact same things. And there's a lot of work associated with this. I first of all need to figure out what the semantics are. And second, I need to replicate those semantics within the context of my JavaScript. This is why it's better to simply use the correct element to begin with, because then you avoid a lot of work. But if you can't avoid that work for whatever reason, you need to make sure that you deal with a key down event or a key up event or a key press event, depending on the interaction that you want. You need to make sure that you deal with things like enter and escape in interesting and normal ways that a user would expect. The code for that might look something like this. You intercept a key down or a key event of some sort. You look at the event, and then you look at the key code. And you need to figure out what the key code actually is. This is space, this is enter. It's generally better practice not to use magic numbers in your code, but instead to set up some sort of constants so that you actually read space or enter. But I didn't have space, so I did this. Also important to note is the W3C has a good document that documents a couple of common keyboard patterns. So things like escape should cancel a dialog box. Things like that are documented relatively well by the W3C. The only problem with that is that it's relatively Windows specific. It's not the case that all keyboard shortcuts are the same on all platforms. So keep that in mind and make sure that you are tuning your keyboard shortcuts to the platform that most of your users are actually using. If we look at the first part of this widget, I said it was in two parts. We'll look at the button first. And this actually acts very much like a button, even though the user has to hover over it. That's not the usual button behavior, but the conceptual behavior is very similar. I interact in some way with this thing, and then a modal dialogue pops up, and I have to interact with that dialogue. So here we're going to act as though this div is a button. We do that, first of all, by giving it a tab index, such that I can tab to it on the page. This means that enter, for instance, I'll be focused on it, I'll press enter, that'll simulate a click, and I'll get some sort of interaction with this button. What we don't have, however, is the label semantic. What we instead have to do is put text into the div such that it actually gets read out when the user focuses on this div. Again, there's no label that can be associated with anything other than an input element or a select element or a form element of some sort. That behavior simply doesn't exist. So you have to make sure that there's textual content in everything that you have on the page. Even if it's like a gear because you're doing some sort of settings menu, you can't simply have a gear as like a background image. It's much, much better to have a div. Actually, it's a button, but if you have to have a div, then make sure that that div has textual content so that a screen reader can actually read it. If we look at the drop-down that pops up when I hover over this thing, this acts much like a modal dialogue. So a modal dialogue is what we should emulate. We should make sure that when I'm tabbing through, that I can't tab out of the dialogue, that I have to make a decision here before I can interact with something else on the page. We should make sure that it's focusable. And we should make sure that the elements in particular are focusable. If you look, there are checkboxes up there. It's a little bit light, but there are checkboxes up there. Those are implemented as divs. So we need to make sure that those also are focusable and that when I do something with them, they behave exactly like a checkbox would. What we can then layer on top of all of this back-end work. So I do all of the event handling, I do all of the markup. What I can then do to add more semantics is to layer on ARIA. ARIA is a mechanism by which I can say that this div is not only a div, it actually has a role on the page. In this case, it might be a role of button. This means that when I use a screen reader or anything that would extract semantic information from the page, it can look at this div and understand that this div is actually a button. This means that the screen reader would read add to circle button, and then the user would understand that they can interact in some way with this thing that they've been presented with. But what's important to note is that this isn't a panacea. This doesn't do the work for you of dealing with a keyboard or of making elements on the page focusable. It simply adds a semantic layer. You still have to do the work of intercepting keyboard events, and you still have to do the work of making sure that these elements are potentially interactable. So these are a couple of examples of ARIA roles that you can have. You can have a button, and this means that it's a button on the page. You can click on it, or you can use the keyboard in order to interact with it. It invites interaction in that case. A menu item is another example, and search is a landmark on the page that a screen reader can give you some information about the semantics of the page itself, not simply specific elements, but the things that exist on the page. So there is a search widget somewhere. I can jump to that potentially. There are sections of the page that have that bind content together in an interesting way. I can jump to those. Screen readers, by and large, at the moment, don't support ARIA landmarks as well as they could. What they generally support are headings. This means that if you have a good heading structure on your page, a screen reader user can easily jump from one heading to the next and get a good understanding of what's on the page. What will be happening in the future is that screen readers will have better support for ARIA landmarks, and then you'll be able to jump to specific landmarks on the page as well. This is already the case in some screen readers, but it's not really across the board quite yet. But it's something that we should start thinking about now and experimenting with now in things like ChromeVox so that we can use them in the future when they become more ubiquitous. It's not only the case, however, that ARIA describes roles on the page. So it's not only the case that I can say it's a button. I can also say that this button, or this checkbox, for instance, has been checked. This means that the div has a role of checkbox. It acts as though it was a checkbox, but it has properties associated with that. In this case, ARIA checked. This allows me to determine programmatically whether or not this item is in a checked state. So if the box should show a check mark or not. It also enables the screen reader then to read that out to me, so that when I focus on this element on the page, the screen reader can tell me it is a checkbox and that the checkbox is checked. So using this sort of state information in order to give the user more semantic information about how the page is put together and what state it currently finds itself in is incredibly useful. The last thing I note here is ARIA live region, or a live region of the page. If you've ever used Twitter, and probably most of you have, you know that when you're typing in your status message, there's a number next to it that counts down from 140. As you're typing, it tells you you have 20 characters left. It's really quite useful to mark this region as updating, as something that the screen reader should pay attention to, even if I'm not directly focused on it. This means if I mark it as a live region, I can type a little bit, and then in a lull, the screen reader can tell me that this thing on the page updated itself. So I type a little bit, I wait, the screen reader tells me I have 20 characters left. ARIA live is the attribute that allows the screen reader to understand that this piece of the page is going to update itself, and that it's important to pay attention to. So if we jump back to the Add to Circles widget, we could implement it something like this, where we have the div for the button. We tell the browser that it's a button. We tell the browser to make sure that it's focusable by giving it a tab index of 0. And we have some text inside of it, such that when I focus on it, the screen reader tells me something interesting. We can set up this thing here as a dialogue. And the ARIA, or the screen reader, will tell me that this is a dialogue that I need to interact with before I move further. And we can make sure that these checkboxes are interactable by giving them a role of checkbox. I didn't put a tab index of 0 here. I should have. I need to. And I need to make sure that there's an ARIA checked attribute in order to tell me whether or not this is checked. So at this point, I would just say there are two tools that I think are really quite useful when testing your own applications for accessibility. The first is Chromebox. It's a completely free screen reader that's relatively easy to use for people that have never used a screen reader before. There's good documentation. It's an extension for Chrome. You can go to the Chrome Web Store, download it, install it into Chrome on any platform, and it will read text to you. This gives you a kind of quick and dirty mechanism for testing the accessibility of your page. It's not going to be exactly like a blind user using your page, because they use screen readers simply differently than I do, for instance. But it's a good sanity check. You can look at your page, make sure that things more or less work the way that you would expect them to when you're tabbing through, that things are in the right order, that things are focusable. That is really useful information. Chrome Shades is an accessibility tool that basically turns off all CSS on your page and makes it very obvious when you have a DOM that makes no sense. So if you look at your page, you read through it, and you have no idea what's going on, then you know that the styles that you've made, that you've applied to your page, are more than presentational. They are in fact semantic, and you need to fix that. You need to make sure that the DOM that you present to a user is usable and semantic. Another screen reader that is quite useful is NVDA. NVDA is kind of I think it's Windows only for Firefox. It's a really great screen reader. It's free, so if you just pop open a VM and start using it, it's really quite good. VoiceOver on Mac is also quite good, but not quite as good, I think, as NVDA. There are a couple of libraries with accessibility support within their UI components. jQuery UI is doing quite a good job. Gwt is getting there. Dojo has done an excellent job. At this point, I think I'm running out of time, so I would ask if any of you have any questions. I'll pop up some final thoughts that you can read while you're asking. Yeah?
Standard implemented as part of HTML5, or is it a separate namespace?
The question is whether ARIA is part of HTML5 or is a separate namespace. To be perfectly honest, I don't know. I know that there was a lot of argument about it. And honestly, I don't care because it's supported in browsers. So whether it's part of HTML5 or a separate standard is kind of irrelevant. Browsers generally support it. Screen readers generally support it. And it is the only mechanism by which you can add the sort of semantic layer to the page. So I would suggest that you use it regardless of what a standards body tells you.
I'm wondering about the role.
The role element, whether I think the role element is in fact part of HTML5 that it validates if you go to validator.new. Whether it's part of the spec or not, I don't know.
What's the state of ARIA support?
The question was what the state of ARIA support is. Modern browsers generally support ARIA and generally make the information available to accessibility tools. So I know Chrome, excuse me, Chrome is working on it. Chrome has relatively decent accessibility support now. If you look at the dev version of Chrome, it's relatively good, and it exposes the sort of semantic information, like a roll of button. That wasn't the case as of like Chrome 12 and Chrome 13. We made a lot of effort in 14 and 15, and we made even more effort since then. So Chrome is getting there. The support in Firefox has been better over time. They're generally doing quite a good job of leading in terms of accessibility support within the browser. And the combination of Firefox and NVDA is quite excellent. So we're getting there with Chrome. ChromeVox, I think, is a really good step in that direction. As I said, it's embedded into Chrome OS, so we're making sure that when we roll out new iterations of Chrome that we add accessibility support. IE also generally has quite good accessibility support, or at least it exposes all of the right things to the operating system layer. That said, IE6 and IE7 don't understand ARIA at all. IE8 has a little bit of understanding. IE9 is really starting to get there. So I would say modern browsers have good support for ARIA, and the support will only get better as time goes on.
Connection between something accessibility, like not putting an X out and getting a W3C validation report, just trying to validate, and you have to have anything out, another connection.
So the question was something along the lines of whether things like alt tags not being there can be validated by tools, or whether that could be part of HTML validation. Is that a correct?
W3C, if you want to have HTML5 and HTML4, and we validate W3C, you have to have all alt tags filled out. Both will give you validation.
The question, okay, so the question is whether alt can be in some way associated with valid HTML5 or valid HTML4. And if you don't have an alt tag, then it would simply be invalid. I think that's unlikely to happen for a variety of reasons. What I would suggest is, you can tell me about it in a moment. What I would suggest before we get there is that there are tools that will help you determine whether your page is accessible. None of them are really exceptional. It really requires some human interaction. But I wouldn't necessarily rely on a validation tool to tell me whether my site is accessible. That's kind of two separate questions entirely. There are, well, accessible pages will validate. I mean, that's the case. If you use ARIA and you use the new, or validator.new, it understands all the ARIA syntax and will validate your page for you. It'll also give you warnings for things like alt tags not existing. What I would suggest is that you look at things like Wcag. There are documents that declare what it means to be accessible. I don't find them necessarily convincing, but they work really well for people like government who have to have a checklist of things that they go through and say this page is accessible. I really think it requires human interaction and human testing, but there are tools out there that purport to tell you whether your page is accessible. Real quick, over here. Okay, so I'm told images will not validate without alt tags, so yay world.
What about access keys? They seem to be gone.
About access keys? I don't actually know if access keys are supported in any browser. Generally speaking, the support, as I understand it, wasn't very good. And everybody implemented it themselves anyway. So my understanding is that the best thing for you to do is to build the keyboard support into your application that actually makes sense for your application. Gmail doesn't use access keys. Gmail does everything via event handlers. Yeah. The comment is that nobody uses access keys anymore. I don't think anyone ever used access keys, or at least that they were never well supported. Okay, well, you did, so that's good. I would suggest that you use JavaScript in order to script your page.
It's
I wouldn't say that it's more accessible to have access keys. To be perfectly honest, I don't know what the current support is for access keys for that attribute.
I'm a strong advocate for accessible web apps, but the product manager is not so much. How can I push it to my product manager?
So the question is, how can a strong advocate for accessibility convince business people that accessibility is important? This is a problem that everyone faces. I mean, Google faces it. You see some of the apps that we have aren't as accessible as they should be. And we're really working to make them more accessible, but it hasn't always been a priority. I think the single most important thing that you can do is to look at your current user base. Generally speaking, the number of people that can't access a web page is relatively low. There aren't an amazing number of disabled people in the world. It is a large number, but probably not large enough in and of itself to convince a business person that this is a really important group. What's more important are the PR benefits, or not even benefits, but PR harm of people saying that they simply cannot use your website. It's good to look at past legal cases. If we were in the USA, I'd say look at the Target case, which was problematic for a variety of reasons. If you're in Israel, I'm told that there is a law coming up that will enforce accessibility in some way for sites that are used by certain groups of people. I know nothing about it, but I am not a lawyer, so everything I'm saying is probably wrong. But I would suggest that you look at the laws in your country. Laws are usually a good way of convincing people that don't otherwise want to be convinced. I think it's probably the worst argument, but it is an effective argument for that type of person.
You can't drive a train with your wheelchair.
That's a bad thing. Anything else?